In this brief presentation, I will talk about my recent work on privacy and security implications of the new wave of regulations of digital platforms or digital services more broadly. This wave includes the new legislative proposals in the European Union, the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, and the Digital Services Act, the DSA, but also some legislative proposals before the US Congress. For brevity, in this presentation, I will just focus on one particular intervention proposed in the EU DMA. The EU DMA and the DSA, they contain several ideas of new obligations on large digital service providers, obligations related to app side loading, that is installing apps outside of manufacturer provided app stores, on data portability and third-party access to user data, and to data of users, of business users of social media platforms and other digital services, and also potentially problematic provisions on access by so-called vetted researchers and by government agencies to data that is processed by very large online platforms. All those have negative privacy and security implications, but today I will just focus on interoperability provisions in the DMA, and I will be talking about the provisions as they are based on the texts adopted by the end of August 2022. There will not be large changes in the final text, but there may be some technical changes to the legislative text still before the text is entirely finalized. Speaking of privacy and security risks, there are several ways of thinking about this. Here I adopt a useful sort of categorization proposed by Cory Doctorow and Benedict Cyphers, who are big proponents of interoperability and even legally mandated interoperability, but unlike many other proponents, especially those involved in the works on the EU DMA, Doctorow and Cyphers were very clear in their work that there are risks in forcing interoperability and that those risks have to be managed. So the first category of such risks is just general friction in ensuring security. You can imagine a situation where interoperability that may require establishing a kind of a scheme or a framework or a set of rules by which information will be exchanged between service providers. If that scheme ossifies or means that service providers cannot make changes to respond to new threats, and that would be a very serious problem given how the quickly evolving the cybersecurity and cyber threat landscape is. So there is an inherent tension between keeping legally forcing a certain schemes of interoperability and allowing enough flexibility for service providers to respond to new threats. There is a risk of phishing or impersonation attacks, and sock puppetry, also a kind of impersonation attack, and because identity verification and account verification is harder to do in a system that is not closed. We all may be familiar with Facebook's famous policy of requiring real names. If Facebook is forced to fully interoperate with other social media platforms, that policy may not be possible to be implemented. And one of the most most harmful examples of how interoperability scheme, which was not designed as secure by design, it was, you could say, insecure by design, that is the telecommunications and specifically phone connections, the functionality of caller ID, the way it's implemented, due to, again, a desire to make interoperability easier, it is trivially easy for bad actors to impersonate any phone number and then to trick their victims, for example, into believing that the attackers represent the victim's bank, and then to convince them to wire funds. That is happening every day, and it is a feature of an interoperability scheme that was not designed with any serious thought for security, user security, and many users are paying for that. So these are more specific examples, but of course there is a broader array of potential problems whenever it will be easy for users to, for example, just with one click, to send all their data to some third party, for example, all their data from a social media platform, to send all that data with one click to some third party. If a user can be tricked to send this data to a Russia-based bad actor, or a bad actor based outside of the EU, then any hopes for the General Data Protection Regulation or other such schemes, enforcement schemes, may be quite futile. So as Dr. and Cyphers themselves say, without new legal safeguards to protect the privacy of user data, this kind of interoperable ecosystem could make Cambridge Analytica style attacks more common, and unfortunately there are no such safeguards connected, at least with some interoperability provisions, and some interoperability provisions in the DMA have insufficient safeguards. So this problem is still with us, and again, the current rules, even according to the authors, very favorable to legally mandated interoperability. The current, for example, privacy protection rules are just simply insufficient. So here are 3 provisions from the most recent version of the Digital Markets Act that impose interoperability obligations on the so-called gatekeepers, the largest service providers. So the first one is a prohibition on restricting users from switching or subscribing to third-party services. The second one is an obligation to allow interoperability with the operating system or a virtual assistant. And the third, a special obligation on interoperability of number-independent interpersonal communication services. For example, you can think of Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and so on. So, given the risks that I mentioned, what safeguards are there in the DMA? Going one by one through those obligations. The first one on a prohibition on restricting users from switching among and subscribing to third-party services. A very good example how this could go very wrong very quickly is that those core platform services of the gatekeeper may include web browsers and third-party services that users may want to connect to include obviously websites, because what else do you connect to using web browsers? But one of the valuable services that web browser developers, including the gatekeepers, provide to the users is warning users and perhaps even including block lists of malicious websites in their web browsers. But implementing a block list is nothing other than restricting a user from subscribing to a third-party service using what is potentially a core platform service of a gatekeeper. And this provision, Article 6.6 of the DMA, has absolutely no exceptions, no security safeguards whatsoever. What is worse, there is a special anti-circumvention rules, a rule in Article 13.6, which applies to the situation from the Article 6.6 and prohibits gatekeepers from offering choices to the end user in a non-neutral manner. But again, blocking or even asking, adding friction for a user to access a potentially malicious website is offering a service in a non-neutral manner. This is an opinionated decision by the developer aimed to protect the user. It's hard to see how this could be squared with this provision, and is a very good example of perhaps limited knowledge or imagination of the authors of those provisions. The second example is the general interoperability provision about allowing interoperability with operating systems or virtual assistants, and this provision does have a security-minded safeguard. So there is an exception for strictly necessary and proportionate measures to ensure that interoperability does not compromise the integrity of the operating system, virtual assistant, or software features provided by the gatekeeper. And that is better than nothing, like in Article 6.6, but not all threats to users and threats which can be addressed by some limitations or conditions on interoperability are threats that go through are threats to integrity of the operating system. Sometimes, for example, in phishing attacks don't really go sort of undermine the integrity of the system, and yet they are still cause harm to users, and harm which potentially could be alleviated or prevented by limitations on interoperability. So there is one problem with that safeguard, and the other problem is a problem with most safeguards, both in the DMA and the DSA and in some proposed US legislation, which is this recurring theme that all privacy or security safeguards are meant to only apply to the extent they are strictly necessary and proportionate. And the problem with the standard is that it is excessive, because it clearly disincentivizes those service providers who are under that mandate from seeking from adopting privacy and security protections because of that very high standard of proof that what they are doing is strictly necessary and proportionate. Of course, it will depend on how the courts interpret this, and there is a possibility of a more reasonable approach by the courts, but in itself this betrays a clear preference of some other goals over protecting the users. Finally, the obligation from Article 7 of the DMA, this was not part of the original DMA proposal, but added later, this obligation of interoperability for services like Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp. There is a categorically different safeguarding provision added here in Article 7.3, which says that the level of security, including the end-to-end encryption where applicable, that the gatekeeper provider provides to its own end users shall be preserved across the interoperable services. And this could be a very good safeguard if it is interpreted to mean that if there is no guarantee that a third-party service provider will uphold at least the same level of security as provided, for example, by Facebook, Google, Apple, then Facebook, Google, Apple, or anyone who's designated as a gatekeeper, that they will, in the best interest of their users, they will simply not be under an obligation to engage in interoperability with such third-party service providers who simply do not rise to the same standard of security. If that's the interpretation, that would be a good safeguard. Of course, if this provision is interpreted this way, it will mean that it may take a very long time, years, and before any such interoperability with at least those service providers who have currently the highest standards of security is in place, and even if some interoperability can be instituted relatively quickly, for example, between those service providers who already have those highest standards of security, this may only be available again to those service providers who do provide this higher standard of security, hence limiting the scope of who could interoperate. So probably hard pass for any two guys in a basement kind of startups, because they will be extremely unlikely to provide the same level of security, including security of data centers and access control, threat detection. The list is almost endless. So, but given that this consequence of such interpretation, there is a risk that the authorities, or perhaps even the courts, will not treat this safeguard provision with sufficient seriousness, and they will say that they will try to water it down, or they will try to sort of interpret those security requirements in some generalized way that would and not really fail to really hold wannabe interoperators to the same high standards as the users are benefiting from today. this all raises questions about what goals and how important those goals served by the regulation, by the proposed regulation are, because it seems quite clear to me that that the DMA betrays a policy preference for privileging uncertain and speculative competition gains at the cost of introducing new and clear dangers to information privacy and security. I don't know how the courts will interpret this, but this is concerning, and I'm afraid that we will hear much more about the privacy and security implications of this regulation once it is in force. Thank you.